I got some wrecking to do. I'll meet you at the finish line!
No, wait! Fix it! Get behind me!
One more!
I'm not through with you yet.
Up we go!
Oh, look at that, it's his little friend. Let's watch her die together, shall we?
No!
It's game over for both of you.
No. Just for me. I'm bad, and that's good. I will never be good, and that's not bad. There's no one I'd rather be than me.
You fool! Why are you going into the law? No, 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 yes, no, yeah, yeah, no, go into the law.
Okay, so a few weeks ago, somebody made basically a shitposty comment on my Facebook page, and in response to my claim that the first purpose of the Second Amendment was to enable the people to meet unlawful force with like force. I did a quick Google search on my phone, and this is what I got. So I'm doing this screen recording now. I should have done it yesterday, but done is done. Anyway, the search term was original purpose of the Second Amendment. And this is what I found. constitutioncenter.org, abundant historical evidence, blah, blah, blah. This exact passage does not appear in the website itself. I have no idea why this is. It strikes me as very, very strange. I'm guessing it's something in the HTML, maybe? I don't know. But it was a strange result to have. Anyway, keep calm and mandatory carry on. So it got me thinking, and I decided to look into it a second time. Google's AI overview says, I want to point this out. First purpose of the Second Amendment was to enable the people to meet unlawful force with like force. As you can see, this is the actual screen share, right? Ew. Well, that's unusual for me, but okay, so as you can see, this is the actual screen share. Google's AI overview said, this statement is generally considered accurate. The primary purpose of the Second Amendment was to allow citizens to defend themselves against unlawful force, including potential government tyranny, by enabling them to meet unlawful force with like force. Okay, I really hate that tyranny line, because at least 90% of the unlawful force you will run into in your life is common criminals, right? You're more likely to run into a terrorist than you are tyranny, at least in the United States. But it does address exactly that line. Okay. Key points to consider: the historical context, but more importantly, the self-defense. The historical context is the founding fathers were wary of a powerful central government and believed citizens needed the ability to resist tyranny with arms if necessary. There's a some there's some debate about that. Self-defense. While the ability to resist government overreach was a concern, the Second Amendment also encompasses the right to individual self-defense against criminals. I want to read that again. Individual self-defense against criminals. Supreme Court rulings. Recent landmark cases like District of Columbia versus Heller have affirmed the individual right to bear arms for self-defense. All right. Well, that's all very, very interesting. But it didn't address this line here. Interpretation, the Second Amendment from National Historic Center. Interpretation, the Second Amendment. Abundant historical evidence indicates that the Second Amendment was meant to leave citizens with the ability to defend themselves against unlawful violence. Missing. Meet. Show results with meet. Well, okay. Let's take a look at it. National Constitution Center's website. It's the link that they offered. The Second Amendment, interpretation and debate. Okay. More in the Constitution. Amendment 2, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay. Common interpretation. Now, this is kind of an interesting point that we'll get back to later. Nelson Lund, a university professor at George Mason University, and Chief Justice Scalia School of Law, and Adam Winkler, professor of law at University of California, Los Angeles Law School. Modern debates about the Second Amendment have focused on whether it protects a private right of individuals to keep and bear arms, or a right that can be exercised only through militia organizations like the National Guard. Pause. 10 U.S.C. Section 246 B2 says that every male between 18 and 45 are the militia. All of you. Even if you're not a U.S. citizen. It doesn't say, actually, it does say U.S. citizen, excuse me. But that's all it really says on the subject. This question, however, was not even raised until long after the Bill of Rights was adopted. Well, that's true so far as it goes. So we're just going to take it as it is. Many in the founding generation believed that governments are prone to use soldiers to oppress the people. Well, many is not all. Many is not even half. As the passage of the Second Amendment eventually did bear out. That was one of the guarantees that the Federalists gave. English history suggests that this risk could be controlled by permitting the government to raise armies consisting of full-time troops only when needed to fight foreign adversaries. For other purposes, such as responding to sudden invasions or other emergencies, the government could rely on a militia that consisted of ordinary civilians who supplied their own weapons and received some part-time, unpaid military training. The onset of war does not always allow time to raise and train an army, and the Revolutionary War showed that the militia forces could not be relied on for national defense. Pause. The Revolution had a lot of issues with the militias. That's true. In certain capacities, they were perfect, and in other capacities, they were absolutely terrible. It is what it is. The Constitutional Convention therefore decided that the federal government should have almost unfettered authority to establish peacetime standing armies and to regulate the militia. Okay, well, again, 10 USC, Section 246, 2B. This massive shift in power from the states to the federal government generated one of the chief objections to the proposed Constitution. Anti Federalists argued that the proposed Constitution would take from the states their principal means of defense against federal usurpation. I know what the word is, I just can't pronounce it. The Federalists responded that the fears of federal oppression were overblown, in part because the American people were armed and would be almost impossible to subdue through military force. Pause. In point of fact, generally speaking, the civilian populace was not only as well armed as the army, but in many cases had superior weapons. They just didn't quite have as many of those superior weapons per capita as the army had of regular weapons. All right, it'd be like if 1 out of 10 of the people had, say, an AR-15 or a BAR, and the army was going to war with M1903s. Okay, it's a little bit of a difference. The rest of the civil population had M1903s, but 1 in 10 had BARs. And the entire army had nothing but M1903s. And if you don't understand, the BAR was a 30-06 detachable magazine fed selective fire, what they called at the time light machine gun. The 1903 was a bolt action clip fed rifle. So there's the slight disparity. Implicit in the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists was two shared assumptions. First, that the proposed new Constitution gave the federal government almost total legal authority over the army and the militia. Pause. No, actually, it doesn't. The militias still reported through their own chains of command. They could be called up and asked to serve or ordered, but those orders could be refused because they still responded at the county level. Second, that the federal government should not have the authority at all to disarm the citizenry. They disagreed only about whether an armed populace could adequately deter federal oppression. Pause. Not long after this were the Whiskey and Shaw rebellions, which were put down with militia troops called up for federal duty against local militias that were refusing to pay taxes. That's the reason why Alexander Hamilton was sent to command those militia forces. That's the truth. Okay, moving on. The Second Amendment conceded nothing to the Anti-Federalists' desire to sharply curtail the military power of the federal government, which would have required substantial changes in the original Constitution. Yet the amendment was easily adopted because of widespread agreement. The federal government should not have the power to infringe the right of the people to keep and bear arms any more than it should have the power to abridge the freedom of speech or prohibit the free exercise of religion. Okay. All right. Much has changed since 1791. The traditional militia fell into, I'm not even going to try to say that word, but disrepair. and disuse. And the state-based militia organizations were eventually incorporated into the federal military structure. Pause. In 1912, the armed forces were reconstructed. The Revenue Cutter Service, Steamboat Inspection Service, Lighthouse Service, and one other I always forget, were merged to form the U.S. Coast Guard. The state militias were reorganized into the National Guard, and the next year, the Lighthouse Service was merged into the Coast Guard. That is over 100 years after the adoption of the Constitution, and in fact, over 100 years after the adoption of the Second Amendment. The nation's military establishment has become enormously more powerful than 18th century armies. We still hear political rhetoric about federal tyranny, but most Americans do not fear the nation's armed forces, and virtually no one thinks that an armed populace could defeat those forces in battle. Pause. Yeah, tell that to the Mujahideen, the Taliban, Al Qaeda, ISIS. Shall I continue? Furthermore, 18th century civilians routinely kept at home the very same weapons they would need if called to serve in the militia, while modern soldiers are equipped with weapons that differ significantly from those generally thought appropriate for civilian use. Pause. Actually, the difference between the AR-15 and the M16 is the so-called fun switch. Yeah, the burst and automatic fire capability. If you were ever actually called up for militia duty with your own weapon, you would probably be directed to the armorer's building for your gun to be retrofitted into an M16. That's just kind of the way it is. That's the truth. As for the belt fire weapons, those aren't actually restricted under current federal law that I'm aware of. So, yeah, that's an interesting development, isn't it? Moving on. Civilians no longer expect to use their household weapons for militia duty, although they still keep and bear arms to defend against common criminals, as well as hunting and other forms of recreation. Well, okay. The law has also changed. While states in the founding era regulated guns, blacks were often prohibited from possessing firearms, and militia weapons were frequently registered on government rolls. Gun laws today are more extensive and controversial. Pause. In point of fact, it does not. In point of fact, the original laws in this subject were the Code Noir from France that said no slave shall possess a firearm or any other deadly weapon. I have not found any English colonial law that says blacks or slaves could not bear arms. I'm sure it does exist, but a lot of black slaves served for both the Revolution and the Crown during the war on a promise of freedom after I think it was typically a year's service. I'm just saying that was the way it was. All right. Another important legal development was the adoption of the 14th Amendment. The Second Amendment originally applied only to the federal government, leaving the states to regulate weapons as they saw fit. Pause. No, it didn't actually leave the states to regulate weapons as they saw fit. That was case law from the Supreme Court. Although there is substantial evidence that the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment was meant to protect the rights of individuals to keep and bear arms from infringement by the states, the Supreme Court rejected this interpretation in United States versus Cruikshank, 1876. Also that. Until recently, the judiciary treated the Second Amendment almost as a dead letter. In District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008, however, the Supreme Court invalidated a federal law that forbade nearly all civilians from possessing handguns in the nation's capital. Pause. No, that's not what the law said, but that's also not what the case was about. The law, first of all, it was DC's municipal code. It's not federal law. Second, the municipal code said that the weapon had to be kept disassembled and locked in one container, with the ammunition locked in a separate container. Dick Heller was a special officer at, I think, actually, I can't remember now. It was one of the federal buildings. Basically, he was a security guard, but he was a sworn security guard. And he was an armed sworn security guard. So a special duty officer. Sometimes you see these various places in municipalities. They're typically retired cops who can only work 20 hours a week or they lose their retirement. And that's what they do. I ran into one in downtown Sacramento. I asked him, what is it you do? And, because I was curious, maybe get started. And first words out of his mouth was, first of all, you don't want my job. Second of all, here's why. I remember he started to irritate me, and then he explained how it was that he got his job. And I realized, yeah, maybe he's right. Maybe I don't want that job after all. But moving right along. He was suing the city of Washington, District of Columbia, because he needed his gun for his job. So he needed to be able to access his gun because he was a high-profile target for somebody to attack, intimidate, break into their house, to steal their gun, steal his gun rather, etc., etc., etc. Yes, he actually had a reason to want to be able to access his gun while he was at home. And they said, no, you can't. That is what DC versus Heller, or Heller versus DC before that, was about. All right. Okay, moving on. A 5-4 majority ruled that the language and history of the Second Amendment showed that it protects a private right of individuals to have arms for their own defense, not a right of the state to maintain a militia. Again, 10 U.S.C., Section 246. All right. The dissenters disagreed. They concluded that the Second Amendment protects a nominally individual right, although one that protects only the right of the people of each of the several states to maintain a well-regulated militia. Actually, this is correct. I believe that's a copy and paste right off of what they themselves wrote. They also argued that if the Second Amendment did not protect an individual right to have arms for self-defense, it should be interpreted to allow the government to ban handguns in high-crime urban areas, which Washington, D.C. is. That's the reason why they need armed guards. 2 years later, in McDonald versus City of Chicago, 2010, the court struck down a similar handgun ban at the state level, again by a 5-4 vote. Pause. In particular, this was the same 5-4 votes. 4 justices relied on judicial precedents under the 14th Amendment's due process clause. Justice Thomas rejected those precedents in favor of reliance on the privileges or immunities clause, but all 5 members of the majority concluded that the 14th Amendment protects against state infringement of the same individual right that is protected from the federal infringement by the Second Amendment. Actually, maybe I should just go ahead and share that screen. 14th Amendment from Congress.gov. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within the jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. Oh, well, that sounds pretty definitive to me. The states can't do something that violates the rest of the law. Here's a little bit you don't normally see. The 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution extended rights and liberties to formerly enslaved people and established citizenship for all people born or naturalized in the United States. Oh, yeah. Because southern states were denying every kind of right to former slaves as punishment for not being slaves anymore. Ironically enough, there was like a half dozen parishes in Louisiana that were not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation. So now that we've gotten past the question of the 14th Amendment, can we move on? Notwithstanding lengthy opinions in Heller and MacDonald, they technically ruled only that the government may not ban the possession of handguns by civilians in their homes. Heller tentatively suggested a list of presumptively lawful regulations, including bans on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, bans on firearms in sensitive places such as schools and government buildings, laws restricting the commercial sale of arms, bans on the concealed carry of firearms, and bans on weapons not typically possessed by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes. Many issues remain open, and the lower courts have disagreed with one another about some of them, including important questions involving restrictions on carrying weapons in public. Okay, so some of this I actually agree with. The merely possession of a firearm by a convicted felon or a mentally ill person. I have some of them in my family. While I love them to death, there's a couple in my family that no, I would never, ever hand them even an unloaded weapon for fear that they might load it with ammo that I don't know they had. I have a cousin who's a convicted felon. I would never give him a gun. Not because he's a violent person, because he's kind of an idiot. Okay, he's a whole lot of an idiot. There's a couple of locations that I agree should be banned entirely. Airports, seaports. Not so much train stations and bus stations, but air and seaports, yes. Restricted very, very pointedly, like schools, right? But then again, I also have an opinion that until school security is actually brought up to the spec that it was supposed to be brought up to with the passage of Safe Schools Act, you need to slow down a whole lot and think very hard about what you're saying. I do agree with some of this. Most of this, or most of what gun control experts want, I pointedly disagree with because they're fucking stupid. Just to show that there's nothing else here. I'm not hiding anything, right? These are some other articles, right? Drafting table. I might want to look into that later. More from the Constitutional Center, Media Library, Constitution 101, Founders Table, right? So there you go. I'm not hiding anything. If anything, I'm being a little spurgy in showing you everything. Jump back up here to the top real quick. Common interpretations. Nelson Lund and Adam Winkler. I didn't notice this until I started reading For Your Sake. I want to point something out to you. Right, so here on Google, interpretation, Second Amendment, abundant historical evidence indicates that the Second Amendment was meant to leave civilians with the ability to defend themselves against unlawful violence, right? For the National Constitution Center, we just read that page. This line does not appear there anywhere. George Mason University. The Second Amendment by N. Lund, cited by 19 people. I wonder what we're going to learn if I were to say, open that page. Nelson Lund, George Mason University of Law, and Adam Winkler, UCLA School of Law. It's the same two people. Or they have the exact same names by just some coincidence. George Mason University School of Law, Second Amendment, Nelson Lund, GMU School of Law, Adam Winkler, UCLA School of Law, National Constitution Center, Interactive Constitution, George Mason University Legal Studies Research Paper Series, LS 15 TAC 23. This paper is available on Social Science Research Network at ssrn.com. Abstract equals 2662700. Okay, I wish I'd realized that earlier, but I just reopened my search bar to the word historical. District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008, is one example. The right of the people protected by the Second Amendment is an individual right, just like the rights of the people protected by the First and Fourth Amendments. The Constitution does not say that the Second Amendment protects a right of the state or a right of the militias, and nobody offered such an interpretation during the founding era. Abundant historical evidence indicates that the Second Amendment was meant to leave citizens with the ability to defend themselves against unlawful violence. Such threats might come from usurpers of the governmental power, but it might also come from criminals whom the government is unwilling or unable to control. The two guys that wrote this article are the two guys that wrote the other article, and Google's AI, for reasons that I can only guess, conflated the two articles. Well, that's very interesting development, isn't it? It goes right on to mention McDonald versus City of Chicago right after that. Okay. It's fairly clear at this point that yes, the first purpose of the Second Amendment was to enable the people to meet unlawful force with like force. It is overwhelmingly more likely that that unlawful force will be criminals. For every one case of tyrannical governments that you can name, somebody can name 100 common criminals. Just street thugs being street thugs. Nothing more than that. Now, there are examples of unlawful force by the state. In case you've never heard of it, McMinn County Tennessee, or as you probably have heard of it, the Battle of Athens. In 1942, I believe it was, a couple soldiers came home on leave from World War II, and the local sheriff was really shaking people down. I mean, he was pretty brazen about it too. He murdered a couple of those soldiers. This was just murder. He was getting away with it for a while because he was very much hooked in with Louis Hughes. Yeah, Louis P. Hughes, better known as Kingfisher. Now, if that name doesn't ring a bell, well, I'm so sorry. Your education has been very badly neglected, and somebody should be ashamed of themselves. But he was, he was what was left of the old Tammany Hall when Tammany Hall was systemically disassembled as a criminal organization. He was one of, I think, three of Tammany Hall who survived the investigations. He was controlling basically half of the old southern states, and one of them was McMinn County because he owned the sheriff. The sheriff was peacefully confronted by other vets as they started to return home. Hey, what happened to these two guys who died? Well, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about that. Oh, well, you're not going to be sheriff anymore. Oh, yes, I am. And he took the ballot boxes to the county jail for safekeeping. Well, that started all kinds of hate and malcontent. And these veterans, who were guys that had just taken on the Nazis, most of them had served in Europe, and weren't about to take a Nazi in the United States. That was not going to pass. Oh, by the way, while he was at it, he had been stationing men at polling stations to intimidate people to make sure that they all voted the right way. Now, in the process of that, another veteran was killed. So now he's got at least two active duty soldiers plus a veteran under his collective belt. And that night he stole the ballots, took them to the jail. These veterans stormed the National Guard armory, took every last gun and every last round of ammunition that they could find. I will include a link to the fictionalized version, and I want to point out that the fictionalized version does romanticize the insurgency quite a bit. It's also reasonably faithful to the actual events, and it is extremely faithful to the just overwhelming disgust that the sheriff had engendered to himself at this point. So yes, it can happen. It has happened in very much living memory. I don't want to get into the details too much because the guy is actually an asshole. But during the Barack administration, if you want to call it that, Barack sent some federal law enforcement to enforce an illegal order. And a lot of the locals said, no, actually, no. They rallied around a guy who really was just an asshole. And a lot of them would later say, we wish we hadn't quite had to fight for this guy, but at the time it was this or they're going to steamroll every last one of us tomorrow. First, they came for the trade unionists with apologies to Chaplain Niemöller, but it is what it is. Ironically enough, I really do want to thank that zit on my dick, one of my constant critics, who A, will lie when the truth would work just as well, and B, won't shut up long enough to listen, and unfortunately will never watch this because he will not watch a video. It's not convenient to him. He'd rather spend an hour and a half whining than spend 5 minutes finding out what it is that he's actually talking about. But the fact that he whined about this subject, ironically enough, did force me to dig into the subject. And now here we are. Yes, the first purpose of the Second Amendment was to enable the people to meet unlawful force with like force. All right, with that, I'm going to say keep calm and mandatory carry on.
The gun has played a critical role in history, an invention which has been praised and denounced, served hero and villain alike, and carries with it moral responsibility. To understand the gun is to better understand history.